as like a company, we really value New Zealand and kind of the image that it gives us.
Yep.
And we want to be a homegrown biotech company essentially. I think we're really lucky here with the early stage like academic entrepreneur ecosystem in New Zealand. There's a lot of support like KiwiNet and Return on Science and Momentum.
Hello and welcome to In the Deep, a deep tech podcast around deep technology and clean tech here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I have today with me Dr Olivia Ogilvie from Opo Bio. We were also lab mates for a period, kind of still in the same lab group. We shared a desk in the lab for a bit. I don't think either of us ever used it. But Liv, why don't you start by telling us about yourself and your background and the company that you've founded?
Definitely. So thanks for the great intro. It's exciting to be here. I'm Olivia, as you've just introduced, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Opo Bio. So I have a mixed background. I have a technical background, so a PhD in biochemistry, hence working in the same department. And I did that PhD on celiac disease, so a very different area to what I work in now. But I guess what my PhD was all about was food engineering and thinking about what our food system can be in the future at the highest level.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how it led into this area that Opo now works in now. After my PhD, I went on to work at Matu Fund, which is a deep tech venture capital fund. And there I learned all about early stage startups and investing. Did lots of due diligence on early stage spin-outs, and I guess learnt a bunch about how to spin out companies and what investors look for and basically the investment process. After that, or at the same time as working at Matu, I was working at the university doing a postdoc. And it was during the postdoc that we developed some of that initial research and technology that we spun out into Opo. So most of that research was done at the University of Auckland. So not by me here at Canterbury, but by colleagues on the same grant at Auckland. Yeah, that's kind of like the highest level about me.
Yeah, cool. And so Opo, I guess, is transforming the future of food here in New Zealand and around the world. Is that too grand a vision?
Yeah, so I guess what we like to say is enabling biomanufacturing from the cell up. So we're a cell line development company. What we do is essentially biotech. We never touch on any of the food end. We leave that to our customers. So what we do is we develop cell lines, which you can think of as seeds or basically like a cultivar. And we take tissue samples from the animal and then take it all the way to something that could grow at large scale in the bioreactor. The platform that we use is cell type and species agnostic, but right now we're working with livestock cells, which is why our main product line at the moment is for cultivated meat, essentially, or cell-based meat. Yeah, so growing cells for food or for materials instead of the animal.
Yeah, that's really cool. And so I guess in terms of the company, you know, this is a deep tech venture. You've seen a gap in the market. There's changing trends around the world with future food and that. So you see Opo as being a major player in the future?
Yeah, so where we want to sit is if you think about like food companies today, you have all of the food brands that you know and are really familiar with that are producing the food that you might buy in the supermarket. But then you have like so many companies and technology providers downstream of that it basically enable that brand to succeed. And we want to be in the downstream end. So we want to be producing the inputs that a company would take to market and then put on the brand essentially of their product. So we call this like a B2B player in the supply chain for this biomanufacturing industry, which is why our focus is on cell lines in this downstream area, not the food. And I guess we believe that there needs to be experts because biomanufacturing is so hard. And like making a food product is very different to developing cell lines and making cell culture media.
Yeah.
And so we believe that there needs to be segmentation across that production chain to efficiently bring these products to market at the scale we need to.
And so you're really playing into your expertise there and the expertise of your team.
Yeah.
And the expertise that's been developed from the universities here in New Zealand.
Yeah. Another thing is that like a lot of the big companies who are trying to do everything, so cell lines, cell culture media, large-scale biomanufacturing, food like manufacturing, and then brand development. They have like massive budgets. They've raised maybe $500 million, and they just haven't gotten that far because they're trying to spread themselves thin across multiple areas. We think the right approach is to have lots of companies working together on parts of that supply chain and bringing diverse products to market.
Cool. You mentioned how much other companies have raised. Are you able to say kind of the ballpark range of what you've raised and what you're thinking you're going to need to raise to make this company work in the long term?
Yeah, so we've raised a seed round. So our first round was our seed round, and that was 1.5 million from New Zealand VCs and some angels. I guess for us, because we're one of those supply chain partners, our goal is to develop revenue very early. So we currently sell products, and we've sold, I'd say, around 100K worth of products to date. But we really want to be like building that up over the next couple of years and getting a pathway to profitability quite soon.
Sure.
But we will be raising a Series A round in probably 24 months.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's really impressive.
And hopefully like 10 million. That's the goal.
Yeah. Right. Can you tell me a little bit about the support that you've had on the journey from being a PhD student to postdoc and now CEO, co-founder of this company? I mean, it takes a lot to do that, a lot of effort on your part, but I guess the support from the ecosystem that you've had.
Yeah, I think we're really lucky here with the early stage, like academic entrepreneur ecosystem in New Zealand. There's a lot of support, like KiwiNet and Return on Science and Momentum. So my main support when I was doing my PhD and exposure was through the Momentum programs. So they're like a
kind of a student-run.
Yeah, so Momentum programs they're funded under the same RFP mechanism as KiwiNet, but through Return on Science instead of KiwiNet, essentially, and their investment committees. There's student investment committees, and that's really where I was mostly involved. But they're run by Return on Science.
Yeah. And I guess for the audience, Return on Science and KiwiNet, also KiwiNet comes from government funding.
Yeah.
Right, and so that's all about trying to develop, those organisations are all about developing commercial applications from research.
Yes.
And building up all the entrepreneurial talent,
yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, both KiwiNet and Return on Science, their kind of goal is to move academic science into companies. They have the same high level goal. They just do it in different ways and service different parts of the ecosystem, essentially. Yeah, and so I had like a lot of support through Return on Science. They funded me to do, or Momentum funded me to do an internship at Matu Fund when I finished my PhD, which is really how I got on to being an analyst at the fund, which was awesome.
Yeah, cool. So what about, I guess, now that you've become a CEO, that's a quite steep learning curve. What support have you had in that transition to becoming a full-time CEO?
It's a good question. I think there's a lot of learning by doing, and I have a really supportive board and team to kind of help provide whatever support I need to do that role efficiently and effectively. Had lots of support from Matu, which was our lead investor. So they are really experts in helping founders build the skill sets and build these companies. So we had a investor director on our board from Matu, Andrew Chen, and he's like provided a lot of mentorship throughout the past 2 years, like personal and professional mentorship. Which has been awesome. But I've also had a CEO mentor, Mike Brown, who's been really helpful, just like somebody to talk to outside of the company and my little ecosystem.
Give a high-level kind of overview. They don't get down into the details.
Yeah, and like kind of like sense check, like, is this weird? And he's like, yeah, that's not.
Yeah, cool. All right, so we talked about the support. I guess, what are the kind of barriers that you've faced in this founding a company, and particularly for you in this cell line bio space?
I guess there's like, because we're a deep tech company, we have both technical and market risk. And for us, I guess over the past 12 months, there's been a big funding crunch, and I don't know if it's barriers, but it's definitely challenges responding to that funding crunch and really changing our strategy to focus on what's going to deliver value that investors perceive as investable, and really balancing long-term investment projects within the company that we believe we need to succeed in the long term versus short-term things that investors want to see as tick boxes to give us money. I mean, there's been a lot of minute challenges, but they're all kind of around workload, balancing resources, and trying to achieve those short-term things as well as those long-term goals.
Okay. Have you had barriers in terms of the regulatory stuff here in New Zealand? Has that been an issue?
Not really. So I guess the biggest regulatory issue for us right now is we don't have PC1
access to facilities.
Yeah, so
absolutely.
Our lab at the moment, we have a wet lab in Auckland, but it only has no exempt. It doesn't have PC1 status, which is what you need to import anything from outside of New Zealand that's a restricted organism, so something that hasn't been in New Zealand. So an example for us that would be really useful is a standardized cell line that other people have used and is standardized in the literature. We can't currently do that within our facility because it's a restricted organism, even though it's very standard. And we can't do any GE, and we can't use any GE tools in our program. Yeah, so those are definitely kind of, I'd say, regulatory barriers locally, specific to the biotech part. In terms of the food part, there's not really any barriers that we face right now. So we have an external regulatory consultant who helps us design our internal regulatory strategy. But we're designing that to be compliant with USDA, FDA, and Singapore Food Agency.
Sure, I guess your major markets are going to be overseas, and as a B2B company, you'll be selling things to overseas or licensing technology overseas. So the New Zealand market in the long term wouldn't be too much of an issue for you.
And in these novel
research phase.
In these novel biomanufacturing products like cultivated meat, the cell line is regulated or assessed as part of the wider assessment of the product. So they look at what is the food safety profile of the meat that the consumer is going to eat, and they look at the whole process. And so what we're doing is just a part of what needs to be assessed for the end product. So we'll never be doing, in the current regulatory approach, any of that.
Okay, cool. I guess, so you don't have access to labs. Funding's a big problem. How are you?
We do have access to labs.
You don't have access to PC1 labs in-house and things like that. How are you getting around some of these challenges that you're facing?
So we are going through the process of getting PC1 at the moment. That's a work in progress. The main barrier for us is CapEx to buy an autoclave. So we just need $20,000 to buy that autoclave to get PC1, and we're kind of just working on that at the moment, budgeting it in and all sorts.
A lot of things to weigh up when you've got a lot of competing
and it's
demands.
a timing question, when do we want to make that investment? When do we need to make that investment? Because we plan to outsource, we outsource some stuff, and we might outsource some of our, if we're doing any GE tools work. What was the other part of the question?
I guess the other side of the barriers that you're facing, how are you getting around the financial things?
We've had a lot of support from NZTE and I guess the local ecosystem. We've been raising funding for a wee while, and we're hopefully near the end of that.
That's great. Cool.
Hopefully good news to announce soon.
Looking forward to it. Do you see there being lower barriers overseas that might entice you or might have enticed you to set up overseas in the future? Is that something that's ever come into your thinking, or are you happy with the New Zealand ecosystem?
We definitely plan to open an overseas office at some point, not within the next 24 months. The PC1 and ability to use GE tool stuff is a reason that we might do that if there were less barriers overseas.
Sure.
But otherwise, as like a company, we really value New Zealand and kind of the image that it gives us.
Yep.
And we want to be a homegrown biotech company, essentially.
Yeah.
We don't want to move too soon. Opening like a second facility with the overheads associated with that.
Yeah.
There would have to be like a really good reason. Like we were spending X amount on external labs, so let's just get our own lab and own staff. That might be like a decision-making point for us.
Sure. What do you see for the future of the food economy in New Zealand and globally? Yes.
It's a big question.
It's a big question.
I think if
You're the person to answer it.
Yeah. If we're talking about like long-term future, so maybe 20 years, we envision that consumers will have like a range of options. So you might go into a supermarket and you'll have your grass-fed beef, your factory farmed beef, and then cell-based and plant-based beef. And the consumers will just have more options on the shelf to choose from that suits maybe their price point, what nutritional profile they're trying to get, and their ethical concerns, and the environmental metrics of each of those products. I guess that's what we envision, that there'll be just a lot more options for consumers.
Maybe a lot more detail, a lot more information so that they know what they're consuming from the sounds of it.
Yeah.
Right, they'll have access to, they can see the environmental impact of what they're eating.
Yeah.
And things like that.
I think in the future, food, well, a lot of people don't understand the environmental impacts of their food, and I can see a world where these novel food protein companies develop a brand strategy around environmental impact. If the price point matches, like it's just another reason that consumers, if the product's tasty, the same price, would choose that product. Yeah.
Cool.
We don't have like a lot of clarity around like what is the impact of the food I'm eating and how can I make decisions based on that when like livestock has like a massive negative environmental impact globally, and there's just not that many measurement tools.
Yeah, it's difficult to measure. I guess if you're producing lab-grown meat, it's a bit easier to track the outputs from a reactor, a bioreactor, than all the cows out in a field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe like another point on it is that I think the food system will look very different to what it does today. I'm not sure what New Zealand will look like. That will depend on the policy initiatives over the next kind of like probably 4 to 8 years, the next 2 terms in Parliament, what the government's incentivise, whether to do we start having an alternative protein strategy as a company, as a country, diversified protein as well. Or are we just going to keep focusing on dairy and like conventional livestock? Because it does come from the top down, I think. Like real change within the next 20 years will come from policy objectives, and we've seen that play out, or the beginnings of it play out in other countries overseas, like Singapore, as they begin to introduce initiatives, even though they don't have any farming, so it's kind of different. But like, we know that top-down policies work and top-down initiatives work. Yeah,
I guess that's a question in terms of the time frames that we're talking about. You know, this isn't, your company's not going to be putting, your company will never put stuff on the shelves directly, but your products aren't going to be on the shelves in the next year. We're talking kind of long-term. What are we talking about there for the time frames?
Yeah, so most companies who would be our customers bringing cultivated meat products to market, they're planning to release products initially in like fancy restaurants, so kind of like Michelin style restaurants, and
fancy.
Like really fancy, and then they're hoping that the food trends, well, the strategy is that you introduce new foods in really high value dining environments, and then it trickles down, and then once you reach quite large scale in restaurants, you can start introducing it into supermarkets when customers and consumers are familiar with those products. So I think that's what all of the companies that have launched products to date have done, and like I can't see a different strategy working just because the products are so expensive right now. And also like there is a consumer barrier for people choosing this. Lots of people are like, don't know what it is and need some education, and a restaurant's a great place to do that.
Cool. Yeah. All right. Well, before we wrap up, the big question that we're kind of asking everybody that we have on, what's the one thing we need to supercharge the New Zealand deep tech ecosystem, in your opinion? What would be your dream thing to see change or, develop?
It's a good question. I think, resources make a massive difference.
What kind of... There's a lot of... resources is quite a broad topic. What are you talking about in resources there? Any specific?
I mean, money would be great.
Yeah.
Money would mean that more people could be hired and progress could be accelerated. Companies could fail faster, which would free up more people and more financial resources again. And I think that's something which is definitely lacking in New Zealand. We've seen a massive change over the past 5 years in terms of the VC environment, but we're still nowhere close to other countries overseas. Companies in New Zealand raise smaller funding rounds. We say we make the most out of the funding that we do raise, but there are always capital constraints in ways that might not exist overseas.
Yeah. I guess where would that capital be coming into the system? Is that more capital from VCs, angels, government, research, at the university level? I guess more money everywhere would be nice. But, of what the ones that are feasible to me, probably government and policy and putting more money into the system that end, or maybe more money, bringing in more money from VCs and things like that.
I think at the early stage is where, because we're always, or most New Zealand deep tech companies are going to go offshore to raise later funding rounds, just because that's where the market is. You want strategic investors within the markets you're entering into, and so we'll try and raise money from those markets to make that journey easier. So at those early stages, before companies are ready to go overseas and raise overseas investment, because right now, when we go to the US and have investor discussions, their questions are all when are you going to move to the US and when's the company going to move here? Maybe then we'll be interested in investing. That's kind of the default, I would say.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because you do want to be able to stay in New Zealand as long as possible, or keep as much of the company here in New Zealand as possible.
Yeah, you don't want to have to move overseas just because
the investors say
you have to.
We're only going to invest in you if you're in the US.
And that's that's a really bad reason. And it would be ideal if there was enough capital in New Zealand until it was actually strategic to be I want to move to Germany because Germany has the biggest manufacturing environment. That is a more strategic reason rather than there's very little capital onshore with not enough appetite for this. We need to move offshore now. That's just kind of a sad reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think probably before Series A, more support.
More support at the early stage, VC, angel level.
And just more support that's educated on when this is enough, or we should give money to this because it's good. Yeah. Rather than keeping it alive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for joining me, Olivia. Dr. Olivia Ogilvie, CEO of Opo Bio. Yeah. I hope everyone has enjoyed this episode of In the Deep. We'll see you next time.
Bye.